Hello everyone, and welcome to my Beyond the Gates official channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Ted and Shanice have become the new gravitational center of Beyond the Gates, a pairing no one inside Fairmont Crest can silence, dismantle, or politically suffocate, because their connection has evolved into the type of secret exposed romance that threatens careers, shatters alliances, and bends the show's moral universe toward open rebellion. And even though Bill, Danny, Randy, Kat, and even Anita in her final, fading months of influence once believed that they could pressure, sabotage, or shame Ted out of the relationship, the truth remains that Shanice has tunneled into Ted's psyche with an intensity that has outgrown manipulation, and now every attempt to stop them only reinforces their resolve. Ted spent months operating as the moral accountant of Fairmont Crest, the man who measured risk before committing, the man who disapproved of Haley's criminal improvisations and Randy's brutality, the man who claimed romance required safety and certainty, yet Shanice dismantled that philosophy with a look, a confession, and the kind of emotional precision that television audiences recognize instantly. The moment when a guarded man stops thinking and starts believing, and because Shanice herself emerged from the underbelly of Fairmont Crest scandal, because she was once tied to Rollins, to underground deals, to whispered side agreements that threatened to send her to prison or worse. The relationship carries the heat of reformation, a love story built on the possibility that darkness can fall in love with conscience, but also that conscience can become intoxicated by danger. So now Ted has shifted from the observer to the participant, and Shanice, who once feared abandonment more than prosecution, now clings to Ted as the single organism in Fairmont Crest who refuses to weaponize her past. This is why Danny hates them together, why Andre whispers strategies to force a breakup, why Lynette gossips to Bill that Shanice is manipulating Ted the same way Haley manipulated every man who gave her power. But the cynical voices cannot compete with Ted's new posture. He would rather destroy his influence inside the gates than surrender Shanice to another political chessboard, and the writers know that this is the exact injection the show demanded after Anita's looming mortality, after Haley's criminal trial, after Kat's pregnancy bombshell. Because every great American television drama hits the pivot where two characters decide that desire outranks reputation, and that decision reshapes a narrative landscape. Yet the stakes grow sharper every week. There are investigations swirling around Shanice's sealed records. Tomas is beginning to question whether Ted has repeated Bill's mistake, aligning himself romantically with a woman whose background might cost the Crest millions, and Randy, bruised and furious, warns that Shanice's previous ties to Rollins will ignite a scandal capable of dissolving corporate boards. But Ted simply repeats that he will handle consequences, and that love, once activated, refuses bureaucratic cancellation. Meanwhile, Shanice's psychology shifts from fear to ferocity. She begins entering rooms without apology. She is no longer the woman begging Fairmont Crest for acceptance. She is the woman daring the mansion's elite to remove her, knowing that Ted will walk out with her if they try. And this power emboldens her to confront Lynette, to shut down sly accusations, to reject the mythology that sinners cannot be loved by leaders, and audiences watching across America identify with her refusal to be humiliated. But Ted's transformation is even more shocking. The once measured executive begins ignoring strategy reports, shielding Shanice from board scrutiny, and exhibiting signs of moral defection that thrill some and terrify others. Because a righteous man who finally chooses desire is far less predictable than a historical villain, and Bill sees this, fearing that Ted is resurrecting the chaos that Haley once unleashed across the estate, and so the spoilers suggest that an intervention is coming, a confrontation staged behind the wine cellar doors, where Danny, Bill, Randy, and even Kat will try to talk sense into Ted, reminding him that Shanice brings liability, emotional volatility, and a trail of past misconduct. But Ted, having already chosen a future outside the mansion's psychological prison, will reject the intervention, telling them that for once he is choosing himself instead of the institution, that he loves Shanice without apology, and that Fairmont Crest can either adapt or collapse. This rebellion terrifies Danny, who worries that if Ted can defy the family, others will follow, and suddenly hierarchy will shatter, because Shanice is not merely a girlfriend. She is a symbol of unauthorized choice, the first character in months to say she does not care what the Gates want. And the audience knows that whenever someone says they do not care about the Gates react with violence, legal, financial, emotional, or, in Haley's case, literal violence. Yet Shanice's commitment to Ted grows deeper when she learns anonymous threats have begun circulating, warning her to disappear, to leave Ted before she is removed. But instead of surrendering, Shanice shows up at the Crest dinner party in a black dress that communicates war, sits beside Ted, and dares anyone to challenge them publicly, producing one of those signature Beyond the Gates moments engineered for sweeping camera zooms and online fan hysteria. Ted's hand rests over hers, a symbolic declaration that no board vote, no legal accusation, no whisper campaign can pry them apart, and now the writers tease that someone, possibly Rollins, possibly a vengeful ally of Haley, possibly even a rogue enforcer hired by Randy, will attempt to break the couple with real damage. Yet the spoiler energy remains anchored in certainty. Ted and Shanice are not a flirtation, they are the new axis of conflict. The unstoppable narrative object that everyone must respond to, because American television has always canonized the lovers who refuse power, and Ted, for the first time, has chosen passion over procedure. And although Fairmont Crest is a nest of secrets where nothing stays pure, the spoilers claim that Ted's loyalty will only intensify once Shanice confesses the last secret she has buried, the one tying her to an older crime that could detonate the entire estate. Yet instead of recoiling, Ted will vow to protect her, making him complicit in whatever storm is coming, and that is the true danger. Because once love becomes complicity, the mansion becomes a battlefield, and two hearts become weapons, and every character watching them, Anita from her hospital bed, Kat from her swollen conscience, Bill from his paranoia, Danny from her jealousy, and Tomas from his detective instincts, understands that nothing destroys a dynasty faster than a man who refuses to give up the woman he loves. That is why no one can stop Ted and Shanice from being together. Not blackmail, not investigation, not institutional shame, not political leverage, not Bill's patriarchal pressure, not Danny's broken-hearted logic, not Randy's intimidation, not Kat's moral questioning, not Tomas's detective files, not Anita's weakening authority, and certainly not the Gates themselves. But the obsession surrounding Ted and Shanice does not merely destabilize relationships, it destabilizes the entire philosophy of Fairmont Crest, because this estate was built on contracts, transactional marriages, controlled romances, board-approved intimacy, where desire was permitted only if it preserved power, and now Ted has detonated that unwritten statute by choosing a woman without pedigree, without immunity, without anything except a willingness to love him without condition. And that act of rebellion forces the audience to re-examine every couple the series has ever produced, from Vernon and Anita's brittle marriage that hid decades of infidelity and emerging resentment, to Danny and Andre's mechanical partnership that disintegrated the second a pregnancy tested their emotional bandwidth, to Bill and Haley's catastrophic liaison that began with seduction and ended with attempted murder. Ted and Shanice represent the opposite trajectory, a romance that begins in mistrust but escalates toward truth, and American audiences crave that reverse descent, when a good man steps out of compliance and a dangerous woman steps out of shame, forging a union that terrifies people who have never risked anything for emotion. So naturally Bill becomes paranoid, wondering whether Ted is building the kind of private kingdom that could challenge his own authority, and Danny begins spiraling, because she once believed Ted could be her emergency exit if Andre failed her, yet now she sees Ted smiling, whispering promises to Shanice, dissolving the fantasy she never admitted aloud. Meanwhile, Shanice grows sharper in her instincts, reading every smirk in every hallway, every whisper behind every antique door, and she instantly recognizes the emerging conspiracy, the plan to legally isolate her, to subpoena her records, to drag Rollins's name back into circulation, to paint her as radioactive. But she also recognizes that none of these tactics will work as long as Ted stands beside her, because Ted is the one thing the Crest lacks, a leader with nothing left to fear, And once a leader stops fearing reputation, his peers lose leverage, so the mansion begins evolving into a surveillance zone. Phones tapped, conversations recorded, board meetings recapped in coded language. And yet Ted does not hide Shanice. He does the opposite, bringing her into daylight, seating her at dinners, letting photographers capture them at charity events, signaling that he is not ashamed, that the relationship is a declaration rather than a secret, and audiences online began hashtagging them, turning the couple into a fandom phenomenon, elevating Shanice from scandal-adjacent outcast into cultural currency. And once fandom christens a pairing, television logic dictates that the writers will lean into the storm, which is why new spoilers tease a looming confrontation between Shanice and the one woman almost no one can predict, Kat, emotionally unstable, increasingly fragile. Terrified by her pregnancy and by Andre's emotional absence, desperate for someone else's ruin so she can feel less broken, and when Kat corners Shanice in the greenhouse, hissing that men like Ted treat danger like a temporary thrill, that he will discard Shanice once the board threatens his salary or his legacy, Shanice does not shrink. She smiles, steady, predatory, and says, "He won't leave, because he's finally with someone who doesn't want his last name, only his loyalty." A statement that slices directly into Kat's insecurity, because Kat has always wanted legacy, inheritance, proof that she mattered. Meanwhile, Tomas, the quiet collector of secrets, prepares a file, a dossier on Shanice's early criminal associations, interviews with former associates, footage from a nightclub incident no one has mentioned in years, hoping to ethically sabotage the relationship before it destroys Ted's moral compass. Yet Tomas underestimates Shanice's capacity for confession, because she will preempt the ambush by telling Ted everything first, every night of survival, every desperate choice, every crime she witnessed but did not commit, and that honesty binds Ted even more tightly. He admires her resilience, he envies her ability to rebuild after ruin, and he confesses that his entire life has been sanitized, curated, and that loving her reminds him he is alive rather than obedient. This terrifies Bill, because loyalty that is earned rather than mandated cannot be redirected, and Bill has dominated Fairmont Crest for decades by weaponizing dependency, fear, and legacy. So when Ted stands at a board meeting and introduces Shanice as "my partner," the room freezes, scandal oscillates through the mahogany architecture, and Bill understands that Ted has chosen exile over appeasement, because to name Shanice publicly is to declare war, and from here the spoilers edge toward violence. Anonymous threats slip beneath Shanice's door. Rollins reappears in the shadows of a parking structure, suggesting he has leverage to sell, and Randy begins floating the possibility of a forced exit, muttering that accidents happen. Yet Ted, once horrified by corruption, now feels the urge to defend Shanice by any means necessary, and that impulse could twist him into the very thing he once feared becoming, a man who destroys rather than preserves. But even as danger closes in, the narrative refuses collapse, because Ted and Shanice keep choosing each other, night after night, argument after argument, fear after fear. And that consistency terrifies the Crest more than any crime, because institutions can defeat scandal, but they cannot defeat devotion, and devotion has become Ted's new ideology. By the time Anita whispers from her cancer ward that love is only fearless when you have nothing left to lose, Ted realizes he has crossed the final threshold. He will not negotiate Shanice away, not even to save his legacy, and Shanice realizes that she has finally met someone who does not require her to amputate her past to earn her future, which means the romance has evolved into something ungovernable, a living threat to the entire social architecture of the Gates. Anita's body, but with her signature on a confidential document, activating a legal nightmare designed to consume whoever dared imagine her death would bring safety rather than chaos. And as the toxicology report circulates, panic spreads like wildfire through Fairmont Crest, turning every familiar street into a theater of suspicion, because now no one is safe from speculation. Vernon, already unhinged by grief and public humiliation, retreats to the Ridgeview estate alone, wandering hallways, once dominated by Anita's presence, muttering to himself about betrayal, manipulation, and the people who wanted her gone. While Danny, emboldened by both outrage and fear, secretly contacts attorneys and forensic accountants to audit every transaction Anita made in the last 6 months of her life, suspecting that hidden bequests and untraceable transfers were intended as posthumous weapons against her own family. And Kat, sensing the perfect storm to execute her long-harbored revenge, launches a digital blitzkrieg, leaking carefully redacted documents to media outlets that hint at offshore accounts, clandestine meetings, and a shadow heir whose existence could legally invalidate Vernon's inheritance, while Bill, ever the shadow puppeteer, maneuvers behind the scenes with a calmness that unnerves investigators, quietly reminding reporters that Anita's death might be less a tragedy than a puzzle she deliberately left unsolved, and that anyone trying to interpret it without understanding her motives is already one move behind her ghost, which the town increasingly believes is haunting them. Meanwhile, Haley, watching from the periphery with a predator's patience, begins quietly influencing the social circle, positioning herself as a mediator between Danny and Kat while simultaneously planting seeds of doubt in Vernon's fragile mind, whispering about coincidences too perfect to ignore and loyalties that die with their masters, which causes him to spiral further into paranoia, eventually locking himself in the study with security cameras on the front gate and a loaded pistol within reach, as though anticipating an intruder. But the real threat is far more insidious, as the private investigator Kat hired discovers a trail of emails and receipts that suggests someone within Vernon's own circle may have hastened Anita's final hours, and suddenly friends, confidants, and long-trusted servants are eyed with suspicion, their every action reframed as a potential act of betrayal. The media, sensing the perfect storm of scandal, amplifies every leak, every anonymous tip, and every cryptic statement, and Fairmont Crest, a town that previously thrived on curated appearances and polite gossip, begins to fracture into warring factions, each with their own theory of what really happened. Each convinced they are honoring Anita's legacy while secretly jockeying for advantage in the inevitable power vacuum, and in the midst of this chaos, Danny receives a cryptic text. She's not gone. She's always watching, a message that chills her blood because it mirrors the tone of notes Anita left in her private journal, notes that hinted at contingencies, blackmail strategies, and posthumous punishments for anyone foolish enough to underestimate her even in death. And as investigators dig deeper, they find irregularities in hospital records, discrepancies in medication logs, and inconsistencies in statements from nurses who claim to have cared for her in her final week, suggesting that someone with medical knowledge, someone patient, meticulous, and possibly obsessed, played a role in her death, which sends Vernon into full-blown hysteria, pacing the estate like a caged animal while muttering about loyalty, murder, and justice, while Kat and Danny secretly compare notes on a series of cryptic letters Anita had left for trusted associates, letters that contain coded warnings, instructions for posthumous legal maneuvers, and veiled accusations against specific individuals, including those who seemed most devoted. And Bill, watching all of this unfold, quietly calculates which pawns will move first and which will be sacrificed, already knowing that Anita's final game is more complex than any single character can comprehend, because her life, her death, and her will are all part of a meticulous design to manipulate, punish, and control even after her body has been laid to rest. Meanwhile, public sentiment sways violently, with protesters